The movie opens with an arena owner desperately trying to convince a wrestler to compete in his ring. Despite knowing that the fighter is in no condition to fight, the owner doesn't seem to care about his well-being. All that matters to him is getting the wrestler into the ring and putting on a match.
We had a bad run on the farm.
I don't care about you, I care about the attention.
But I don't lose.
The story then shifts its focus to a man named Joe, a professional wrestler who takes on dangerous matches against multiple opponents. He isn't doing it for fame or glory. Joe is simply looking for a way to make some extra money, even if it means putting himself through brutal fight. The money Joe earned from his previous fight still isn't enough to cover his debts. So instead of walking away, he decides to keep fighting. And despite facing one opponent after another, Joe proves why he's considered such a formidable fighter. He takes down every challenger with ease, barely giving them a chance to fight back. After the match, Joe heads to his girlfriend Estrella's house to recover and clear his mind. Although he's clearly been injured, especially around his face, he keeps the fight a secret from her. But fighting isn't Joe's only source of income. He also works as an avocado farmer, helping manage Estrella's family's farmland alongside his longtime friend Loves and several experienced workers who have spent decades taking care of the plantation. Then Lopez brings Joe some bad news. A disease has spread through part of the crops, forcing them to cut down the infected trees and burn the remaining stumps. Joe understands that this is part of farming, but the treatment and recovery costs are going to be extremely expensive. That's a serious problem because the harvest is their main source of income. Joe depends on the farm not only to support Estrella, but also to pay his workers. Later, Joe asks Estrella to go to the market with their friend Marco. They need to buy some vegetables and, more importantly, find out whether the farm's avocado harvest can still be sold. During the trip, Joe explains why he chose to live in the countryside. He once had trouble with several members of a cartel, forcing him to leave his old life behind. Eventually, he moved away with Estrella and began working on her family's farm. But farming alone wasn't enough to make ends meet. That's why Joe also returned to fighting, to earn extra money and keep the people depending on him afloat.
Is who we worked for? Yeah, sometimes we definitely chose wrong.
While Joe is at the market, two local thugs suddenly approach him. These aren't strangers. Joe recognizes them as enemies from his past back in the city. They mock him and even threaten to beat him, treating him like a helpless gringo, a foreigner who supposedly has no power in their territory. Joe refuses to take the bait. Rather than turning the situation into a bigger confrontation, he tells Marco that they should leave. After all, Joe only came to the market to buy a few vegetables. He wasn't there looking for trouble. But just a few blocks away, Joe notices something unsettling. A suspicious vehicle has been following them ever since they left the market. And his instincts are right. The men inside are the same thugs from the market, and this time they've come after Marco. Joe refuses to let his friend become their target. A violent confrontation follows, and Joe manages to take down the attackers. Knowing they can't leave any evidence behind, Joe tells Marco to help him bury the bodies and get rid of the items they were carrying. They even set the thugs' vehicle on fire, hoping to destroy any evidence that could lead the police back to them. After taking care of everything, Joe drives Marco home. Before they part ways, Joe makes him promise to keep what happened a secret, even from Estrella. The last thing Joe wants is for the woman he loves to become worried about the dangerous problems surrounding him. The following morning, Joe goes through an intense workout in Estrella's yard, determined to keep himself in fighting shape. Estrella notices what he's doing and asks him to stop fighting. She believes the farm can provide everything they need and doesn't understand the real dangers Joe is facing. Later, Joe heads to the plantation to check on the workers and make sure everything is running properly. But instead of finding only the farmers, he encounters two unfamiliar men. One is Baptiste dressed in a white jacket, while the other is a dark-haired man named Rye. Baptiste seems particularly interested in Estrella's family's plantation. He looks Joe over and immediately realizes something doesn't add up. "You don't look like a farmer's." Baptiste then claims that he's looking for his driver. Surprisingly, Joe offers to give him a ride home. Still, something about the encounter doesn't feel right. Joe can't shake the feeling that these strangers may be hiding something, and that agreeing to help them could lead to trouble.
Thanks again.
Realizing that Baptiste's arrival could put them in serious danger, Joe urges Estrella to pack her things and leave the farm as soon as possible. But Estrella doesn't understand why he's suddenly acting this way. Joe refuses to tell her what is really happening, leaving her confused and unwilling to simply abandon their home. Before they can even finish packing, Baptiste returns. This time, he pretends to be interested in buying their entire avocado harvest in bulk. Estrella, unaware of his real intentions, feels obligated to be polite and invites him inside, offering him whatever refreshments they have. Once they're seated, Baptiste repeats his offer. He's willing to pay a very high price for all of their produce. But Estrella politely turns him down, explaining that they already have regular buyers. Then Baptiste reveals something that immediately changes the atmosphere. He knows the history of Estrella's family. He even knows that her father once had connections with dangerous people. Joe and Estrella are stunned. But Baptiste isn't finished. He also knows about the incident that happened the previous day. Joe immediately becomes nervous, realizing these people have been watching them far more closely than he thought. Still, Baptiste doesn't seem particularly concerned about what happened. Instead, he simply tells them to reconsider his offer. "Think about my offers." Before leaving, he gives them his phone number. Then Rye suddenly walks inside without even knocking. His unexpected appearance immediately puts Joe and Estrella on edge. They fear that the situation could turn violent at any moment. But Baptiste casually apologizes for Rye's behavior and then leaves with him. The moment they're gone, Joe tells Estrella they need to leave immediately. He knows the cartel won't stop coming after them until they get what they want, the plantation. Estrella finally agrees. Before leaving, Joe asks Lopez to look after the farm until the situation becomes safer. But Joe still can't stop thinking about Marco. After what happened the day before, he needs to know whether his friend is safe. So Joe and Estrella head to Marco's house. The moment they arrive, Joe senses that something is wrong. He tells Estrella to stay inside the car while he checks the area himself. Then he notices a familiar man walking out of Marco's house. Joe immediately realizes that something terrible has happened. And his worst fear is confirmed. Marco is lying motionless inside, having been killed by the cartel. Joe's attempt to protect the people around him has failed, and now the cartel has made their message painfully clear. After Estrella leaves, Joe returns to the house one last time to see Marco. Standing beside his friend's body, Joe makes a silent promise. The people responsible will pay for what they did. But before he can process his loss, dozens of cartel members suddenly arrive and surround him. Joe fights his way through them and manages to escape. Then things get even worse. Baptiste arrives with another group of armed men, determined to finish Joe themselves. Joe immediately runs for his life. Baptiste watches him get away and angrily blames Rudy for failing to stop him. He refuses to let Joe disappear again, grabs a rifle and fires several shots in his direction. But Joe manages to escape the gunfire. Convinced that Joe has been fatally wounded, Baptiste and Rudy return to their headquarters and focus on finding him. They have no idea that Joe is still alive. Joe eventually makes it back to Estrella, who has been waiting for him. But he is badly injured. One of Baptiste's bullets has struck him in the abdomen, leaving him in serious condition. With the cartel still hunting him, Joe and Estrella hide inside an abandoned building far from the city. Joe knows the situation is only getting worse. If Estrella is going to survive, she needs to know how to protect herself. So despite his injuries, Joe begins teaching her basic fighting skills. But there is another problem. They are running out of monies. With almost nothing left, Joe approaches an arena owner and asks for a chance to fight. He needs the money to keep Estrella alive and cover their expenses. The following day, Joe and Estrella arrive at the arena. Joe is scheduled to fight several opponents, and the owner expects the matches to be difficult. But Joe has no idea that Baptiste and Rudy are there too. Their real target isn't Joe. It's Estrella. They plan to kidnap her, forcing Joe out of hiding and eventually pressuring him to give up the farmland. In the middle of his fight, Joe suddenly realizes something is wrong. Estrella is nowhere to be found. And the only person he can see connected to the cartel is Rudy. Joe's anger explodes. He takes his frustration out on his opponent and overwhelms him before immediately leaving the arena. All he can think about now is Estrella. Once outside, Joe completely loses control. He destroys everything in his path, consumed by rage and grief. The cartel has taken the only person he has left. And Joe swears that every person responsible will pay. Before starting his revenge mission, Joe visits an underground weapons dealer to obtain firearms. But there's a problem. He doesn't have enough money to pay for what he needs. The dealer refuses to make the deal. Joe decides not to leave empty-handed. After taking down the dealer's men, he takes the weapons he needs. And before disappearing, Joe makes sure the dealer won't be able to reveal his whereabouts. Now armed and with Estrella's life hanging in the balance, Joe prepares to go after the cartel himself. Joe eventually reaches a remote plantation that serves as Baptiste's base. Moving in quietly, he takes on dozens of cartel guards by himself, one after another. After clearing the area, Joe finally gets inside and comes face to face with Baptiste. With his rifle aimed directly at him, Joe demands to know where Estrella is and orders everyone to drop their weapons. Then Joe makes another demand. He tells Baptiste to call the cartel's leader and bring him there immediately. If Baptiste refuses, Joe makes it clear that he won't hesitate to kill both of them, and the cartel boss will be next. Rudy, who has been provoking Joe from the beginning, suddenly starts arguing with him. The situation is seconds away from turning into another bloodbath, but Baptiste manages to calm everyone down. And then the truth finally comes out. What exactly has Baptiste been planning? Surprisingly, he hasn't harmed Estrella at all. In fact, he's been protecting her from the cartel members who wanted to hurt her. But Baptiste has his own agenda. He plans to betray his boss and take over the cartel for himself. Not long after, the cartel leader arrives with a large group of men and surrounds Baptiste's compound. Instead of attacking immediately, the leader sends one of his men to negotiate. His message is simple. He wants Estrella's family's plantation back under his control. But tensions quickly rise when Rudy tells the messenger to leave. And rather than helping his boss capture Joe, Baptiste finally makes his move. He kills Rudy because he refuses to let anyone interfere with his plan to overthrow the cartel leader. Baptiste then explains to Joe why he decided to betray his boss. But Joe isn't interested in the politics or Baptiste's ambitions. His goal is much simpler. He wants Estrella and her family to regain control of their land. So instead of fighting Baptiste, Joe agrees to join forces with him. Together, they prepare to take down the cartel leader and his men. The situation reaches its breaking point when the cartel boss finally steps forward. He orders Baptiste to hand Joe over, revealing that Joe was responsible for killing his son. Now there's no way to negotiate. Realizing that things are about to spiral out of control, Joe makes his move. Without hesitation, he takes down the cartel leader. And just like that, the man who had been hunting Joe throughout the entire story finally meets his end. With the gunfight still raging around them, Joe tells Estrella and Baptiste to get out of the area immediately. He stays behind to hold off the cartel members who keep closing in. While Estrella and Baptiste rely on their guns, Joe chooses a much more brutal approach, taking on the attackers with nothing but a machete. Thanks to the fighting skills Joe taught her, Estrella moves quickly through the chaos, taking down several enemies with surprising precision, even though this is her first real battle. And she isn't the only one fighting. Baptiste also throws himself into the battle, taking on wave after wave of cartel soldiers. Despite their differences, all three of them now share the same objective: bringing down the cartel leader and his men who have terrorized countless families in the region. As more enemies continue pouring into the area, Joe, Estrella, and Baptiste fight side by side. Working together, they manage to eliminate the remaining cartel forces, and finally bring the long-running conflict to an end. Once the dust settles, Baptiste approaches Joe and congratulates him. The cartel is finally gone, and Joe has reclaimed Estrella's family's plantation. With everything finally over, Baptiste decides to leave the couple behind. He walks away without revealing exactly where he's headed next. Meanwhile, Joe turns his attention to Estrella. Despite realizing that the timing probably couldn't be worse, Joe decides to propose to her. After everything they've survived together, he wants to start a new chapter of their lives.
I know this may not be the most romantic moment or the best timing.
Yeah.
If I had to describe this movie in one sentence, I'd say it's a story about a man who keeps getting pushed into violence because he's trying to protect the people he loves. Joe starts out as a fighter, but he isn't chasing fame or trying to prove that he's the toughest man around. He simply needs money to support Estrella, her family's farm, and the workers who depend on him. That's what makes his character interesting. Joe clearly has the ability to walk away from violence, but his past keeps finding him. The moment Baptiste and the cartel enter his life, everything begins to fall apart. First, Joe loses his friend Marco, then he becomes a target himself, and eventually Estrella is kidnapped just to force him out of hiding. At that point, Joe has every reason to completely lose control. And honestly, this is where the movie becomes a classic revenge story. Joe doesn't have an army behind him. He doesn't have unlimited money or powerful connections. What he does have is experience, determination, and a very strong reason to keep fighting. But I think the most interesting character isn't actually Joe. It's Baptiste. At first, Baptiste looks like another villain working for the cartel. But later, we discover that he has his own plans. He wants to overthrow his boss and take control of the organization for himself. So when Joe finally confronts him, things aren't as simple as good versus evil. Baptiste is still dangerous, but his interests temporarily align with Joe's. And that's what allows the two men to work together. I also like the way Estrella's character develops. At the beginning, she's mostly someone Joe is trying to protect. But after Joe realizes that he can't keep her safe forever, he starts teaching her how to defend herself. By the final battle, Estrella isn't just standing behind Joe anymore. She's fighting alongside him. That change gives her character a much bigger role in the story. Of course, the movie isn't perfect. Some of the action feels exaggerated, and Joe sometimes seems almost impossible to stop. He gets shot, chased by an entire cartel, fights multiple enemies, and somehow keeps moving forward. But that's also part of what makes this kind of movie entertaining. It's not trying to be a realistic crime documentary. It's giving us a straightforward action story where the hero gets pushed to his absolute limit and refuses to give up. What I think the movie does best is show that Joe isn't really fighting because he enjoys violence. He's fighting because every time he tries to escape that life, someone he loves gets dragged back into it. And that's the tragedy of his character. He wants a peaceful life. He wants the farm. He wants Estrella. But the world around him keeps forcing him back into the fight. By the end, Joe finally gets what he's been fighting for. The cartel is defeated, Estrella is safe, and her family's land is back in their hands. And after everything they've been through, Joe decides to propose to Estrella. It may not be the most romantic